Welcome to our latest explainer. So picture this. You're walking back to your car after a super long day. The weather's nice, you're already thinking about what's for dinner. And then, boom, you see it. That dreaded little slip of paper trapped right under your windshield wiper. A parking ticket. Almost instantly, the whole vibe just changes, right? It's not just the sudden anxiety over, an unexpected expense. There is this very specific, sharp sense of confrontation that washes right over you when you look at that piece of paper. Today, we're going to unpack exactly where that feeling comes from. We're taking a deep dive, starting from the incredibly mundane annoyance of a parking fine and zooming all the way out to the foundational structures and, honestly, the potential collapse of human civilization itself. It's a wildly fascinating sociological breakdown, and I promise you, by the end of this explainer, you will literally never look at a local traffic cop or a city ordinance the exact same way again.
So why do we feel that sharp confrontation? Like, why does a simple, everyday administrative penalty feel like a deeply personal attack? Well, our source material today suggests that this totally mundane annoyance is actually our very first clue into a much, much darker systemic blur. When you look at an enforcer, with that cold, detached expression as they're writing you up, you're actually experiencing this incredibly razor-thin, almost transparent boundary between strict legality and arbitrary punishment. The source argues that this ambiguity, it's not some accident or a flaw in the system. Actually, scratch that, it's totally permitted. In many ways, it's quietly encouraged by everyday law enforcement structures. It's really not just about enforcing the rules, it's kind of our entry point into a very cold game of leverage. And this brings us to a frankly chilling concept from the text, the micro-sacrifice of power. We're shifting gears now from your personal annoyance over a $50 fine to a full-on clinical autopsy of organizational behavior. So a micro-sacrifice of power is basically a systemic mechanism where minor, arbitrary exercises of authority act as hidden rewards. The source presents this really unsettling truth. When a grassroots enforcer seems almost, ruthlessly enthusiastic about penalizing you, our first thought is usually, man, that person just has a terrible attitude, right? But sociologically speaking, the state is actually handing that enforcer a tiny, highly addictive thrill of control, a literal power pleasure over your life. It's this quiet psychological trade-off just to ensure their absolute compliance to the larger machine. All right, moving into section 1, ticket, micro-sacrifice of power. So how exactly do these vast, super slow-moving bureaucratic machines maintain the absolute loyalty of their lowest-level enforcement nerves? The actual people out on the streets, standing in the rain, writing those tickets? The answer lies in how that micro-sacrifice actually plays out in real time. As you can see, there's a really stark contrast happening here. On one side, we have the citizen's reality. For you and me, the ticket means financial anxiety. It's a disrupted daily rhythm, maybe a totally ruined afternoon. But on the flip side, the enforcer's reality. Imagine being an ordinary public servant and realizing that just your signature on a little pad or the click of your radar gun can instantly alter the financial state and emotional rhythm of a complete stranger. That is an incredibly potent feeling. Our source describes this as an addictive thrill of control. It basically functions as an invisible subsidy, like a psychological bonus paid out by the state right on top of the regular salary. This invisible subsidy is exactly what keeps that massive bureaucratic machine highly sensitive and completely obedient at its very fringes. Let's head into Section 2, Violence Premium, looking at a U.S. police sample. The absolutely crucial point here is that this dynamic scales up. We're shifting our explainer now from the micro level of a parking ticket to a much more lethal macro level application. We're going to look at the U.S. police force strictly as a sociological case study, exactly the way our source analyzes it. Because think about it, if a parking ticket is a minor sting, what happens when this premium of power is paid out not in fines, but in ultimate force? Let's step through this grim escalation. We start at step 1, the pen. This is the arbitrary disposal of time and money via a fine. But here's the thing about the logic of arbitrary power. It naturally seeks to expand. And that brings us to step 2, the gun. Consider the tragic, honestly all too common U.S. case studies where a totally routine traffic stop for a broken taillight or an expired tag rapidly escalates into a fatal shooting. From a sociological perspective, this isn't just a random anomaly. It is firearms literally becoming the ultimate tools of judgment, all under the protective cover of concepts like procedural justice or self-defense. Which leads straight to step 3, the ultimate conclusion. The source uses a very cold, analytical lens here to point out a truly dark administrative reality. Dead men tell no tales. When arbitrary power is just left totally unchecked, ending a life can sociologically become the most tempting, frictionless way to close out an encounter. It's the ultimate power trip, permanently sealed. And this whole reality breeds a terrifying truth. To quote the text, that non-cooperation is not born of inherent rebellion, but from a profound survival instinct. In the face of unchecked power, literally any explanation might trigger the urge to pull the trigger. Let that sink in for a second. This directly addresses why specific demographics hold such deep systemic distrust toward law enforcement badges. According to the sociological framework we're reviewing, this distrust is absolutely not some inherent rebelliousness. It is a sheer profound survival mechanism. When you're dealing with a system where the enforcer gets a subconscious thrill from arbitrary power, and where that power includes lethal force without strict counterbalance, well, making a sudden movement or even just offering an explanation becomes incredibly dangerous. The urge to pull the trigger is fueled by that exact same unchecked, arbitrary disposal we saw with the parking ticket, just magnified to a lethal degree. Which brings us to Section 3, Hatred, Accumulation, and Civilizational Crisis. So what happens when this dynamic repeats millions and millions of times across decades? Let's zoom out even further. We've gone from the windshield to the street corner, and now we need to look at how this whole dynamic threatens the very foundation of human civilization itself. Let's walk through this destruction button logic. Simulating a sociologist's perspective, first, order is historically maintained by organizations and states through downward suppression via these grassroots enforcers. Second, because of the totally arbitrary nature of this power we've been discussing, systemic hatred and repression silently accumulate at the bottom layers of society, just builds up. Third, this accumulation obviously isn't infinite. It eventually hits a critical threshold. And finally, when that threshold is breached, the long-term destruction is absolute. The civilizational structure inevitably fractures. The core takeaway here, the real so what, is that any society built on a localized order of arbitrary harm of one group by another is, sociologically speaking, literally counting down a clock to its own structural collapse. And widespread grassroots hostility? That is the ultimate warning sign. When you see local enforcers displaying universal apathy, coldness, or even outright hostility towards the public, sociologists view this as a massive red flag. It's not just a local glitch, it's not a training issue. It is seen as a systemic rotting, a literal gangrene of civilization. It's the visible symptom of all that invisible systemic hatred accumulating right beneath the surface. Let's pivot to Section 4, Poverty, Cost of Legal Harm. Okay, let's abruptly pull back down from these grand overarching theories of civilizational collapse and return to the harsh, incredibly personal reality of everyday life. Because as we all know, the weight of this arbitrary power does absolutely not fall evenly on everyone's shoulders. Consider the stark disparity in who actually absorbs this legal harm. We're talking about the capacity to absorb punishment here. For the wealthy, or even the comfortable middle class, that parking ticket we started with, it's just noise on a monthly credit card statement, a minor annoyance, right? But for the poor, for individuals struggling at the very edge of survival, that exact same fine operates entirely differently. Poverty strips away the buffer zone. A fine is no longer just a penalty, it is a direct extraction of their will to survive. The reason the swing of this bureaucratic club hurts so much is simply because some people lack the financial armor to deflect it. And really, this brings us full circle. That intense, hot anger you feel over a parking ticket? Yes, obviously it's about the money, and yes, it's about the power trip of the enforcer. But the source suggests it's also something much deeper. It is an unvoiced grief. It's a sudden, jarring reminder of how utterly fragile we are within this massive, arbitrary machine. We basically have to constantly walk through our lives on guard, not just against obvious dangers, but against these legally sanctioned thrill-seeking blows from the very system designed to maintain order. In a way, we're just mourning our own vulnerability. Which leaves us with this final lingering thought. As you go back out into the world navigating traffic stops, bureaucratic red tape, and the thousands of micro-interactions with authority, I want you to observe these power dynamics in play. Look for those invisible subsidies, notice the lack of buffer zones around you, and ask yourself, in a system fueled by the micro-sacrifice of our autonomy, how do we preserve our own tiny bit of dignity against that massive, arbitrary machine? Keep that in mind next time you see a slip of paper trapped under your windshield. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep observing and keep learning.